Hi everyone. So in our last few videos for chapter 9, we've been looking at what alleles are and how they can change through mutation. And then we've also looked at how allele frequencies can change amongst populations. And now we're looking at the why. So why is a diverse range of alleles so important for the survival of organisms? So this will be 9b and 9d. So before we get into it, we're going to go through environmental selection pressures because these are the main reason that we need diversity in our allelic frequencies. So this is pretty much just any factor within the environment that can influence the survivability of a species. So it might be things like predators, diseases, food sources, competition, climate change, literally anything in the environment that may impact how an organism survives. If we have more diversity in our the alleles of a population, we're more likely to survive these sorts of changes. So these factors allow for natural selection, which is what we're going to go through in this lesson, which is the selection of the phenotype most suited to overcome the environmental selection pressures. So if we have more diversity in our population, it's more likely that an individual is going to have a phenotype that is going to be selected for, which is going to allow survivability and is therefore going to allow the species to continue to live. So the example I'm going to be using throughout this PowerPoint is Darwin's finches. So Darwin's finches are several bird species that Charles Darwin observed over several different islands, and he noticed that they all looked different depending on where they lived, even though they were all finches. So in a particular environment were a variety of finch species. They feasted on seeds, fruits, and insects. Due to climate change, the environment only had hard-shelled seeds available to eat. Which bird would be chosen through natural selection? So this is a change in food source. So the environmental selection pressure is a change in the food source that they had access to. So originally they had access to a variety of foods, and you can see that this has led to the evolution of a variety of beak types. So we have good allelic diversity in the alleles that are coding for the beak types in these birds, which have allowed them to adapt to a variety of food sources. However, an environmental selection pressure has changed, and now there's only hard-shelled seeds to eat. So we can assume that the bird that has the beak that is most suited to hard-shelled seeds, which would probably be bird number 1, because he has that big, broad, strong beak that could crack open a hard seed. This bird is likely to be chosen through natural selection because it's most likely to eat. So this bird would be able to get through the seeds and would therefore be able to eat the seeds and survive and reproduce and make offspring, whereas these other bird types would not be able to eat and would be more likely to die or less likely to reproduce offspring. So how would this change the population? Well, we would see an increase of this allele that codes for bigger beaks because the offspring would have this allele, and therefore would have more birds that would have the stronger beaks and less birds that would have the thinner beaks. So this is how selection pressures can cause natural selection in species. So the organisms that are more suited to an environment are considered to have higher genetic fitness due to the presence of advantageous phenotypes, which arise due to alleles. So like the example we gave, the bird that had the wide, strong beak would be able to eat the food, it would be able to survive, while other finches do not. And that means the alleles would be passed down in the offspring, and it would lead to a higher allelic frequency of that beak type. So because fitter organisms have a selective advantage, they're more likely to survive and reproduce. So it's really important that they can reproduce. So those alleles are passed down, and this is how that allelic frequency changes. So environmental selection pressures are the main driver in those allele frequencies changing. So now that we know what environmental selection pressures are, we can now look at natural selection. So we now know everything that we need to know to be able to understand how natural selection occurs for the evolution of species. So there are 4 basic conditions that have to occur for natural selection to be able to occur. The first one is variation. So that's what we looked at in our first video. So we looked at different alleles in a population in a gene pool, and we looked at how mutations can cause variations in that gene pool. So the only way that variation can occur in a population is through those mutations that lead to phenotypic differences. So in the example we've been using, this would be the different beak types in the finches. So there'd be different alleles that would be coding for those different beak types. We then have a selection pressure. So that is any environmental pressure that impacts the survivability of the organism and their ability to reproduce. So in our example that we gave, that was a reduction in food sources and a change to only hard-shelled seeds. So that was the selection pressure that was working on these finches. We need to have a selective advantage. So that's where diversity becomes really important, because the more diversity we have, the more likely we are to see an individual that has a selective advantage. So this is when an individual has a phenotype that is more advantageous for the environmental selection pressure, which makes them more likely to survive and reproduce. So in our scenario, it was those big, broad, strong-beaked birds that had the selective advantage, which allowed them to reproduce offspring. If we had, not as much genetic diversity and we only had thin-beaked birds, it'd be very likely that the finch species would actually become extinct because it wouldn't be able to survive the selection pressure. So we need to have that selective advantage. And then the last one, like we talked about, is heritability. So that mutation in that allele, that needs to happen in those germline cells. Because remember, this needs to be a heritable characteristic. It needs to be able to be passed on to the offspring so that the allele frequencies can change over time. So they're the 4 conditions required for natural selection to occur. And this would probably severely change the finch species. So we might see, if this was to continue, that these finch might all soon possess that hard, strong beak, and we'll have less diversity in our finch species. So as always, we're going to bring it back to what the impact is on genetic diversity, because that is what promotes the survival and evolution of species. So just like in our finch example, we had a fitter individual. And this fit individual had an allele that coded for an advantageous phenotype, which was the wider, stronger beak, which made that finch more likely to survive and reproduce. These advantageous traits become more common in a population, because if the fitter individual can survive and reproduce, therefore those alleles are getting passed on to the offspring, and this is when evolution starts to occur. Because let's say that this environmental selection pressure continues on, eventually all of the other beak types would probably die off, and then you'd only have those hard, strong beak-typed finches, and they might become an entirely new species altogether. They might separate away from the other finches. So the survivability of a species is dependent on this genetic diversity. Just in case that different selection pressures arise, there's always going to be a phenotype that is going to be able to survive that selection pressure. However, so normally normally genetic diversity, promotes natural selection and allows individuals to survive, but there are, of course, some instances in which a selection pressure can actually reduce genetic diversity. So if there's already low genetic diversity in a population, or if the population is really small and there's less diversity in the alleles in those populations, it's likely that an environmental selection pressure will actually lead to lower populations or even extinction of a species. So it really depends. Natural selection really depends on the genetic diversity in the population. So now we're going to go to 9D. So we've looked at how natural selection can occur in a population, so how the evolution of species can happen. And sometimes when species evolve, they can actually speciate. So what that means is, for example, with the finches, that one group of finch, which was the same species, if one finch was introduced to a new selection pressure and it developed a different beak type, it might actually become a new species altogether. So what speciation is, it's the process by which populations genetically diverge until they become distinct species. So for instance, with our bird types, if we have a bird with a big beak and a bird with a little beak, if they continue to evolve eventually they might form two completely different populations, because there's going to be, a lot of this allele here, a lot of this allele here. They might speciate, so they might become different species. So when genetic differences accumulate through mutations, natural selection, genetic drift, and gene flow, that's when speciation can occur. So remember, mutations are what has to happen in the allele for diversity to occur. Natural selection is when fitter individuals are selected for in the face of selection pressures. And then we have our genetic drift and our gene flow. So remember, genetic drift is a change in allele frequencies due to a random event. And then our gene flow is a change in alleles due to things like migration and interbreeding. So there's two different types of speciation that we're going to go through. And the really important point is, when do we know when this species of bird and this species of bird have finally become two different species? So a different species is categorized by two individuals no longer being able to breed to produce viable offspring. So if these two birds were to breed, if they can no longer produce viable offspring, they are said to be new species. So we can also compare DNA sequences as well, but obviously this data is a little bit harder to get, so it's normally through that breeding. And this is a really, really slow process. So the time it takes to accumulate these mutations, have individuals selected for all these things is very, very slow. So the first kind of speciation we're going to look at is allopatric speciation. So this is when a new species forms as a result of a geographical barrier. So a geographical barrier could be anything like that's physically there separating two different populations. So in this example here, a mountain range has popped up, or the development of a river, or something that's physically separating populations. This physical separation of populations prevents gene flow. So remember, gene flow is like migration, interbreeding, all those sorts of things. A geographical barrier is going to prevent those from happening. So what that means is that there's going to be different selection pressures on either side of the mountain, and there's also going to be different allele frequencies on either side of the mountain as well. So if we look at our Darwin's finches again, it was hypothesized that these species underwent allopatric speciation because they were on different islands, and those islands were separated by ocean, and they prevented gene flow. And there was different food sources on those islands, and therefore all those finches developed different beak types. So it's a physical separation of two populations, which allows different alleles to be prevalent in those populations, and because there's no gene flow, that can cause speciation. We also then have sympatric speciation. So this is again the formation of a new species, but in this scenario, they're in the same geographical location. So they haven't been separated by a mountain range or something like that. This is happening in the same location. This is normally happening in plants, because it's pretty hard for this to happen with animals, but this happens a lot in plants. So the populations in the same geographical location can experience different selection pressures. So even organisms that are in the exact same, space, they can still be facing different selection pressures, such as like pH in the soil, light availability, things like that. And this, of course, results in different phenotypes developing due to those different selection pressures. So if you have, a tree that is in the sunlight, and then we have another tree over here that's in the shade, that's two completely different selection pressures, and therefore this plant might develop, might be selected for, things that help with prevention of water loss, whereas this plant might develop things to help with light-dependent reactions, something like that. So that's how sympatric speciation can occur. So one really good example of this sort of speciation is in the Howier plants, which is on an island in Australia. So there's two very distinct species of Howier palms, but they're in the exact same location, so they both reside on this island. And it's hypothesized that it was differences in soil pH that caused the speciation of these two different palms. So we had a palm tree that was in more acidic soil, and then, further down the line, we had a palm tree that was in more alkaline soil. And due to this selection pressure, they've both been selected for different phenotypical differences that allow them to survive in that soil type. So they have speciated. So hopefully this helps. If you have any questions, please bring them to class and I will see you there.